podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello, welcome aboard and welcome to the seminar on globalization. Coming next, we're going to discuss, the issue of the pitfalls of globalization. Namely, does the globalized economy hurt nations? And there's no consensus regarding the benefits and pitfalls of globalization, neither within nor between countries. If you take, for example, France, the vast majority of French people, around 75%, still think that globalization is bad for France, for its culture, and for its workers. Although France is not a much globalized country, according to KOF, its ranking is only 18, and according to Ethicornet, France rating is only 25. But despite this modest globalization, the global economy is still perceived as a threat. In fact, most of the developed countries are still skeptical regarding the merits, benefits of globalization. And in fact, you will find less skepticism in developing countries, fast-growing countries such as India, China, or the Philippines. They regard globalization as a springboard, to generate wealth and development. This lack of consensus can be observed by, looking at two categories of scholars, economists or political analysts. We have those pro-market forces, starting with Smith, with Ricardo, with Friedman, Rostov, Schumpeter, and Friedrich Hayek. And those critical of market forces and economic liberalization, such as, of course, Marx, Keynes, Polanyi, Krugman, and Minsky or Stiglitz. This is not, a purely abstract academic debate. In fact, yesterday and today, each government must make a choice, must take position regarding globalization. This has an impact, on the state's intervention, on economic or financial deregulation. And we have, as you can see, little consensus, across and maybe between countries regarding the benefits and pitfalls of globalization. Well, what is clear is that, this lack of consensus stems from the fact that globalization has subordinated politics to economics. It has also, more recently, subordinated economics to finance. There is, in fact, a twofold decoupling, a twofold emancipation. In the first phase, 1970s, 1980s, the economic system, cut loose with the political system. The economic system emancipated itself from the political system. And more recently, in the 1990s, it is the financial system, which basically cut loose, was emancipated from the economic system. Now, the first phase sees a gradual emancipation of economics from politics. Why? Well, we have, since the 1970s, flexible exchange rates. Central banks do not decide which is today's exchange rate. We have economic and trade liberalization, economic openness, thanks to the IMF, WTO, or the GATT. We have also a number of programs of privatization, not only in developed, but also in developing countries, in Latin America, for example. We have what I call an economic pilot, Maastricht. We have a number of Maastricht economic criteria that each and every member of the Maastricht group must respect, must implement. We have also the Washington Consensus, as I will show in a few minutes. Governments are bypassed by market forces and scrutinized daily, by international organizations, the IFIs, like the IMF, and rating agencies. And rating agencies, basically behave like professors in a classroom. They are going to rank and to rate, to grade countries between AAA and C, with a sort of borderline, which is BAA, below which countries are no longer investment grade. And that makes highly difficult to attract foreign direct investment and capital flows. There is, since 1990, the so-called Washington Consensus, which was proposed by Williamson, the American economist, and it gives a number, 10 key rules of economic policymaking aimed at liberalizing and opening countries to the global economy. Privatization, deregulation, flexible exchange rates, interest rate liberalization. In fact, all in all, it boils down to reducing the state intervention in the economic activities. There is some correlation between economic liberalization and economic growth. Why? Because, economic liberalization will promote competitiveness, will promote efficiency, and this has an impact on economic growth. GDP will increase. And we can see that most of the countries embarking on economic liberalization have benefited. I'm not telling you who within the countries, but GDP increased in these countries. And why? Because economic liberalization will lead to banking intermediations, saving mobilization, entrepreneurship spirit, trade openness, and all this, will end up into a rising middle class of consumers. There is also a correlation between economic freedom and human development. And why? Because economic liberalization will stimulate infrastructure development and institutional strengthening. And this will be coupled with social spending in such sectors as health, education, justice, And this will lead to development which will benefit from dynamic economic growth. Now, something else happened, much more controversial, in the 1980s and 90s, which is financial deregulation, financial globalization. In fact, in a nutshell, the toothpaste got out of the tube. This is what I called the emergence of hyper-finance. Starting in the 80s and 90s, we have capital market deregulation, a number of crucial financial innovations, dematerialization, such as derivatives, options, securitization. We have the impact of the NTICs on financial transactions. And we have something totally new, the too big to fail banks, global banks, which in fact, would lead to systemic risk, hence threatening the entire socio-economic system, not only within, but between nations. What we have, in fact, is the emergence of free will finance. It's easy to illustrate. Look at the screen. We have, bank assets starting, to grow much more rapidly than GDP since the 1960s. These assets, are loans, credits, but not only. It's also equity, derivatives, bonds. And the assets to GDP ratio, climbed since 1980s, much more rapidly than GDP. This is obvious in the case of the US financial sector. Financial assets, are more or less equal to GDP until the 1960s, and then we see a sharp rise, in the ratio of financial assets to GDP up to 4 times GDP. When? On the eve of the financial crisis in 2007. And that contributed to the systemic risk, forcing the US government to intervene and to embark into expensive banking bailout programs. It is not the monopoly of the US. In most of the developed countries, bank assets are larger than GDP. Probably the highest is in the UK. The British banks, account for 3 times GDP. And France, not much less, 250%. In many of these countries, it means that if one of these banks would go bankrupt due to a run on deposits or due to a large increase in non-performing loans, NPLs, governments would be forced to intervene with costly bailouts in a typical hostage situation. That's exactly what happened, back in 2008 and 2009. And a good example in the US is the 2008 Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, leading to $700 billion of purchase of distressed debt. Typical hostage situation. We can see that global GDP today is $74,000 billion. Well, financial assets are 4 times as large, 4 times global GDP. This is, I think, is a good measure, of free will finance, of hyper finance. This increase in the so-called financial depth is recent. It started only in the mid-1990s until today. It is a byproduct of financial liberalization and financial deregulation. It means that finance, is less and less focused on the real economy. There is a decoupling between global finance and global economy. The finance is not a monopoly of the US, nor of EU or Japan. In fact, as GDP grows, as economic development speeds up, financial depth increases. And we see that each and every emerging market country, has a growing ratio of finance to GDP. Is that bad? Is globalization a threat? Well, as I said earlier, there is no consensus, neither between academic scholars nor in the political field. So let's see a few myths regarding the pitfalls of globalization. Well, the first one is that globalization is supposed to generate growing wealth and benefits for all. But number one, economic benefit, if it's reduced to GDP, will not tell you much regarding the sharing of wealth, the poverty eradication, the income distribution. It will not tell us, if GDP increasing is producing sustainable development. In fact, what we see is that, the wealth, the global wealth today is still controlled by a few number of developed countries, the 34 OECD countries. How much do they account? 50% of the global population, but 50% of GDP and 61% of global trade. Now, these 34 developed countries are, of course, the US, EU, and Japan, but also a few emerging countries such as Chile, Poland, Korea, Mexico, and Turkey. Israel is the latest to join the club back in 2010. So as Ashraf Ghani wraps up, globalization is a good engine, for growth, but not for growth distribution. Income distribution, in fact, is less and less equal. Between the 1950s and 1970s, there's a clear income redistribution process at work in the US. The American dream, in fact, is working more or less. The poorest 20% of the population have seen their income growing by 120%, much more than the 5% richest. However, since the 1980s, it is the contrary. The poor families have seen hardly any income improvement, while the richest got a lift, improving their income by more than 80%. And this does not take into account capital gains. In a nutshell, the winner takes all. The share of total income of the richest 10% in the US is rising from 1/3 in the 1960s to more than 50% today. France is not in a better position either. Per capita income of the 5% richest in France keeps growing, while that of the 10% poorest shrinks since the global crisis of 2008. So a major impact of the global crisis has been wealth concentration and growing income gap, not only in France, but also in Spain, in Italy, and of course in Greece. Looking at developing countries, the situation is still worse. GDP has been rising fast, yes, growth rates of 6-7%, dynamic economies, but income inequality and wealth gaps have become worse and worse. The Gini index, which measures income inequality, is very bad, not only in Asia, in Africa, in Central America, but all over Latin America, including in fast-growing economies such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Mexico. The second myth is that globalization leads to catching up and take off. Well, definitely not in the 1820s until 1960, at the colonial era. Catching up started, yes, in the so-called development decade of 1960s, thanks to large amount of financial transfers from north to south. And since 1990, there's not much catching up, in fact. There's a rising gap, income gap, between and within countries. Until the 1960s, the bulk of the pie of GDP was in the hands of a small number of developed countries, the OECD. In the 1980s, the share of the emerging countries, developing countries, starts rising, and today, 2013, it's more or less equal. It is not before 2030 at the earliest that the share of the developing countries in global GDP will get much larger than that of the 34 developed, rich countries. Today, the economic divide is exactly 50-50. 160 countries share 50% of global GDP. Of course, China, has a large and growing share of GDP, around 15%. And we should not say, welcome China, we should say, welcome back. As in the 1820s, China's share of GDP was 1/3. China was in the 19th century, the largest economic and geopolitical actor in the world sphere. It fell sharply at the time of the Opium War, at the time of the Mao Revolution, and it started to increase again, in the 1980s. And today, again, China's share of global GDP is 15%. So all in all, what do we see? Well, we see that the US share is around 19%. The EU, the 27 countries, all in all account for 20%, China 15%, and then we have a large number of countries basically fighting to get a larger share of GDP, but still marginal. Russia, for example, had a share of global GDP of only 3%, Brazil less, 2.8%, and the others are outside the radar screen. So when will the curves cross? Well, probably around 2015, if you take not only the population, GDP, reserves, commodities, these non-OECD countries will see, an access to a larger share of global wealth. But again, this doesn't say anything regarding wealth distribution within and between countries. What is clear is that globalization, is still marked by deeply rooted, stubborn poverty. Poverty is declining, of course, due to these large transfers of wealth from north to south. But still today, if you take 2010, you have 2.4 billion people living with less than $2 per day, and the so-called extreme poverty, $1.25 per day, which means $450 per year, which is not much, You have 1.2 billion people. Just to give you a measure, you have to compare with, let's say, Norway and Luxembourg, where GDP per capita reaches $100,000. The next myth is that globalization will be the end of cyclical boom and bust, stop and goes, endless growth for each and every country. The end of history, basically, history of volatility, of crisis. Well, the global crisis, in fact, has illustrated the impact of the spillover effect, of contagion, of contamination. And we are back to cyclical ups and downs, cyclical stop and go. So we have to ask ourselves if there is, in fact, a risk of a long-term decline of economic growth, if basically, the engines of growth are missing today. Well, the first problem, is the rise of automation, which of course produces productivity, but less and less employment. So that might be, bad news for China and harder for many emerging market countries to compete, with their low wages. The second challenge, comes from the global supply sources. That MNCs basically, use a fragmented chain of production, producing in a number of countries. And the production chain, is scattered around a large number of countries. And this might be bad news for countries such as South Korea or Brazil, which have built, a nearly complete industrial base. There is also a wider economic gap, not only between, but within countries. And this, in fact, has a negative impact, on the consumer base. The rising middle class might be large, in China or Brazil, where you still have a large number, of people living beyond the poverty line. There is also the challenge of aging population and falling fertility rates in many countries. In fact, the risk of many countries, including Russia, including China, is that they will be old before being rich. So all this means that we might forget, the takeoff prospect for many countries. What we are going to have is probably, development enclaves, spots, regional spots, of development in cities, which are going to be globalized, but vast part of the territories will still be, largely underdeveloped. In fact, there are signs of economic and social tensions, not only in developing countries such as Africa or the Middle East, but in the US. If you look, for example, the US median family income, for the first time since the 1920s, we have a fall in this income in 2008. A sharp impact of the global crisis, has been basically to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, hence a wider income gap. Will the shale gas revolution, solve the matter and meet the challenge of the growth engines? I'm not sure. In fact, a few countries will benefit. Definitely the US, the Eurozone maybe, But in fact, it will be probably a zero-sum game, impacting negatively, of course, on the world producers of gas and oil. And the combination of large infrastructure investment, technological innovation, and cheaper oil and gas might boost GDP. But where and for whom? It is likely to lead to a zero-sum game. The next myth is that globalization is takeoff for all, dynamic growth engine whose momentum will lead to takeoff. Well, in fact, takeoff happens, yes, but for a small number of countries, it is still a remote dream for the vast majority of the developing countries. It is sure that the BRICS are catching up. India, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, will sooner or later, catch up the EU, the US, and maybe Japan. Many things, in fact, might, of course, impact this catching up. Positive factors, in these BRICS countries might speed up the catching up. Negative factors in the developed countries might also, help the BRICS to catch up quicker than expected. But in fact, what is true is that all these curves crossing each other, are the byproduct of economic and financial projections. Balance of payments, trade, GDP, money and banking, but there is no political input here, and many things in the political sphere happening in India or China or why not, in the US or the EU might impact on this pace of catching up between the BRICS and the developed countries. If we look at a long-term trend, we see that definitely there is a clear takeoff of the US and the UK in the 1850s and in the 1950s, Europe and Japan. For Brazil and China, it is less clear. There is a soft takeoff in the 1990s. But what is sure is that there is a growing gap between the US and the developed countries and between the developed countries and China and Brazil. The global crisis, might change the deal, though there are clear signs, of soft landing in China and Brazil, in Brazil where economic performance has been disappointing. The next myth is that financial globalization stimulates economic growth. The openness of the financial sectors in developed and developing countries is a new engine of fast economic growth. Here, in fact, we have two schools. On the one side, we have those like Fisher, Summers, and Coase, who think that, in fact, yes, financial globalization is a clear engine of fast-growing GDP. And those like Stiglitz, Krugman, Rodrik, who are much more skeptical, concluding that, in fact, financial globalization increases volatility. What is the evidence? Well, not much. The only thing which is clear is that volatility is a byproduct of financial liberalization. It happened in Asia in the late 1990s, It happened also in the OECD with the global crisis starting in 2008. In fact, for many, many countries, premature financial globalization leads to capital flow volatility and financial crisis. What is crucial, is a twofold move. On the one side, financial opening, yes, but on the other, institutional strengthening. A few analysts, in fact, go up to conclude that financial liberalization will be a drag on economic growth, leading to, in fact, decoupling between the real economy and finance. More finance is not better, as in fact it leads to a declining productivity in the real economic sector. What we can see also is that those developing countries which have relied less on foreign capital have grown faster. And why? Well, if you look at, for example, Mexico, Brazil, or China, these countries, have had large current account surplus, which means, they are less dependent on importing capital flows from the global economy. Hence, they are less dependent, on the volatility of these capital flows. That's exactly, the point tackled by Stiglitz. Stiglitz considers that premature deregulation of finance, is leading to volatility, capital flows going in and out, and in fact, crises. In conclusion, it is almost sure that globalization contributes to economic growth, but coupled with volatility, financial crises, and wealth gap, not only between, but within countries. So growth is not development. Development is economic growth, yes, plus all those conditions that make it sustainable. And those conditions are infrastructure development, institutional strengthening, health, education, and some kind of popular mobilization. So development is not only a policy, but also a political choice. Yes, you can have economic growth of GDP with bad governance and high corruption. That's possible. Look at many countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Tunisia is a good example. 5-6% growth rates during the Ben Ali years, much growth and little development. So to transform economic growth into long-term sustainable development, GDP increase is not enough. Countries must also, promote socio-political inclusiveness and good governance. So globalization is not to be blamed, for a low human development index. Many countries which have a low HDI, in fact, have bad governance, high corruption. They are not poor. Guinea, Burundi, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mozambique, are not poor. Congo is not poor. They are in fact rich countries with poor people. You have in fact growing GDP based on raw materials, oil for many countries, but little development due to very weak governance. Thank you.